Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
My name is Kevin Scofield. I'd like to welcome Scott Rosenberg, who's visiting us as part of this speaker series today. Scott's here to discuss his new book, Say Everything, How Blogging Began, What It's Becoming, and Why It Matters. Blogs are everywhere. They've exposed truths and spread rumors, made and lost fortunes, brought couples together, torn them apart, and changed the political landscape. Say Everything chronicles blogging's unplanned rise and improbable triumph, tracing its impact on politics, business, the media, and our individual lives. Scott tells the story in a very personal way by tracing the stories of the individual people who made it happen. He also speculates on what happens next now that the blogosphere has become an unstoppable force, but with Facebook, MySpace, and Twitter quickly rising in prominence. Scott's a journalist, editor, and blogger. He was co-founder of Salon.com and an early participant in The Well. His first book was the best-selling Dreaming in Code, 24 programmers, 3 years, 4,732 bugs, and 1 quest for transcendent software. Right after the talk, Scott will be signing your books if you want to up here, so just come on up to the podium. Please join me in welcoming Scott Rosenberg to Microsoft to discuss his book. Thanks, Scott.
Thanks. Thanks so much. How is my level here? Can you all hear me? Is that good? Oh, you pulled that one away. We have the 2-mic problem. Thanks. So it's great to see you all here. My book, as Kevin said, tells the story of blogging. Where did this thing come from? Who got it going and what were their stories? So it's kind of contemporary history. And when people hear that, I get 2 reactions. There's one group of people, mostly in the technology industry, that says, blogging? That's old hat. It's 1999, you know? We've moved on. And then there's another group, and this group is maybe a little bit more numerous, that says, blogging? History? What history? It's so new. How can there be a history? So in fact, blogging by that name is now a decade old. And websites that were really blogs in all but name have been around since roughly the mid-1990s. So there's a lot of history, a lot of stories, tales of what happens when people get the chance to say everything they want to in public. And I think these stories have a lot to teach us. Those of us working in the technology industry can learn how innovations emerge in ways that we never expected or planned for. And everyone can learn from the experience of blogging's pioneers about how to navigate the opportunities and the pitfalls of life online. The culture of Silicon Valley, of the technology industry, and certainly of the web tends to have a very short memory. And even though the story of how blogging began is a recent one, it's not that well known. I thought it would be a good idea to get it down while it's still fresh. And I watched a lot of it myself firsthand. So let's go back to the early days of the web in the mid-90s. I don't know, many of you, oh, I'm sorry, my slides are not advancing. Oh, there we go. Many of you have probably seen this video, the medieval help desk. Anyone, you want to raise your hand if you've seen it? You know, this is the one where the monk, the Scandinavian monk, is freaked out about this new thing called a book, or as he pronounces it, a book. He has to ask this help desk guy to explain to him how to open it, how to turn the pages, and so on. He's used to scrolls. Books are this weird new interface. It's a reminder that every technology we take for granted today was once forbidding and unfamiliar. And the web was the same way. So a decade ago, I was the technology editor at Salon.com. My job was to find and assign stories about the web and computing. We had to get 1 story a week at first, and later we ramped it up to 1 story a day. And we'd take these stories, we'd edit them, we'd illustrate them, and we'd publish them with a certain amount of loving care. And people liked it. You know, we did good work, but we could only do so much. Now, there were a bunch of other websites that I found myself returning to over and over during the course of my day, because every time I returned to them, they had something new. These sites didn't put a lot of time and effort into each story. In fact, they didn't really publish stories. They posted items. And some of them were produced by professionals. Others were amateurs or one-man shows. They all shared a couple of traits. They linked a lot. They weren't afraid, the way so many news sites were, of sending you away, because they knew that you'd probably be back. Even more important, they didn't have a lead story or a top story. Each time they posted something new, it went at the top of the page. Now, I was an editor, and I spent lots of time in meetings that were held for the purpose of deciding what goes on top of the page. And here, these sites were saying, we don't need you to do that. Let the timestamp make the decision for you. So this was a little distressing, a little hurtful even. But I kept going back to those sites anyway. They worked. They got the news out fast. And it was also really easy to figure out what was new since my previous visit. So in 1998, people began calling these sites weblogs. And in 1999, that got shortened to blogs. And what the early bloggers had discovered was a way of organizing writing that was native to the web. It wasn't an import from print or broadcasting, and it wasn't discovered by people like me who had arrived online with our heads full of notions from print and broadcasting. It was discovered by outsiders who fell in love with the web and what it could do. So Say Everything tells some of their stories. In the first part of the book, I tell the tales of some of blogging's founders, people who established many of the norms of the blogging world, but whose own stories each have a bit of a tragic dimension. None of these people actually get from their blogs what they set out to get. In the second part of the book, I tell how blogging scaled up from a tiny world of a few dozen bloggers to the millions that we have today. And in the final section, I look at what the rise of blogging has meant for our culture, for journalism, and for the future. So, what is a blog? We don't have a very good formal definition. We tend to fall back on that old Supreme Court formulation of how to recognize pornography. We know a blog when we see it. The usual definition is a personal website where the newest material goes on top, often with lots of links to other sites. Now, that definition is useful. It's also pretty neutral. It describes a form. But blogging was also the embodiment of a vision, the first implementation to scale of the idea of a two-way web. Today, I want to talk a little bit about where that vision came from and how it came to be embodied in this simple form. Now, many of you, I'm sure, know already that the idea of web pages as read-write documents goes back to the origins of the web itself. It was the original vision of Tim Berners-Lee and his collaborators. It was a sort of a paradise that we lost through early implementation compromises and have spent years trying to circle back to. Now, that's a pattern that you find recurring throughout the history of technology and media, because big visions are rarely fully implemented at first. And in fact, this notion of the read-write web page, it goes before the notion of read-write documents as the heart of a collaborative environment predates the web. It goes back to the first dreams of hypertext collaboration in Douglas Engelbart's famous 1968 demo of his online system. It returns in Ted Nelson's Xanadu project, which was kind of like the web, only all the links went both ways. And we see it again in the original web browser that Tim Berners-Lee used at CERN, which, if you can read, says Hypermedia Browser Editor. It was a tool for reading and writing web pages. Now, when Mosaic and Netscape popularized browsing, they punted on the writing part. So pretty much did all the other browsers. And we've been dealing with the consequences ever since. Now, it would be nice if we could say that blogging emerged consciously and deliberately as a way to restore that vision. But it was much more haphazard, a matter of chance and luck. Now, of course, the early web had plenty of bottom-up contributions. Let me show you this page from a 1995 link list. If you can read the bottom line, some person has exerted themselves to create the Weekend NPR's All Things Considered homepage. NPR hadn't done it for themselves. Some person, some fan presumably, stepped forward and did it. But to do stuff like that in 1995, you needed to know some HTML, you had to know how to FTP the document, set up your server space, and so on. Even later, when companies like GeoCities came along, they made it easier to publish a web page. But updating the pages was a real pain. And these services eventually became vast wastelands because people just put up pages and then sort of let them decay. Blogging was where most people got their first picture of what a valuable web built by everyday users might really look like. So let's break this definition of blog down a bit. There are three elements: the personal website, newest material is on top, and there are lots of links. So, personal websites. Where did this idea come from? Who got the idea that a website could or should be personal? I think it begins with the idea of home page. Now, a home was a concept that was introduced in the earliest days of web navigation. Home was where you could always return if you lost your way in the hypertext thicket. Home was the root of the tree. Only later did home as a metaphor kick in, and people started talking about my home page as a sort of a digital front porch, a place to display bits and pieces of their lives. The pre-web internet had always had ways for individuals to present themselves. There were .plan files on Unix-based systems, there were introductions on mailing lists, and so on. But the rise of personal websites was not a foregone conclusion in the early days of the web. A key person in making that happen was Justin Hall. That was his site I showed you before with the NPR All Things Considered link. Hall was a 19-year-old college student who started his site links.net in January of 1994 and started posting daily in 1996. Now in 94, the web was mostly filled with academic research. Hall looked at it and thought, hey, I can make a website and it can be all about me. He also started linking to other sites he found that he liked, that he thought were cool or weird. So right there you have two foundations of blogging, autobiography and links. Now Hall was sort of the original oversharer. He really did know no boundaries. He really did say everything, including detailed accounts of his love life and even sometimes nude pictures of himself. I won't show you those. A decade later, after 10 years of this, blogging every day, many years, he fell in love with a woman who told him basically, it's the blog or me. Now, Hall did make the sensible choice in this situation. I'm happy to be able to tell you. When I interviewed Hall's friend and mentor Howard Rheingold about him, Rheingold told me that Hall has what he called an endearing habit of shoving you aside, sitting down at your computer, and reconfiguring everything for your own good. Changing the settings of your web browser and your word processor, arranging your desktop using helpful features that you didn't even know about. In a sense, Hall did the same thing for the web itself. In its formative stages, he turned it into an arena for youthful self-exposure. He took a medium that had been conceived as a repository for scholarship and scaled it down to personal size. Then he took his confessions and intimacies and blasted them out to the world. The web made all that possible, but Hall made it the norm, the expected, the default. Now, another key figure in the shaping of the web as a personal medium was Dave Winer. He was already a successful software entrepreneur when the web came along. But as a developer for the Macintosh, he'd felt burned. Apple owned the platform, and independent developers were at that owner's mercy. The internet looked exciting to him. It was a new platform that no one company owned. Winer saw that the web gave everyone the opportunity to tell their own story. He saw that that mattered not only existentially, the way it had mattered to a 19-year-old like Justin Hall, but also practically. It mattered in terms of his business and his work. Now, Weiner had started an email newsletter called DaveNet in 1994 because he felt that the tech industry press did a lousy job covering his field. He saw that the rise of the internet meant the participants in the industry didn't have to depend on these trade publications to tell their own stories. They could do it themselves. They were the people formerly known as sources. Weiner went on to create one of the earliest and most influential weblogs, to develop some of the technology that today's blogs run on, and to proselytize for blogging. He foresaw a future in which billions of people would have their own personal websites. He was sometimes mocked about that by dismissive journalists, but he was right. Now, he did at some point swap the B for an M, and from that point on, he was really correct. He also harbored a hope that these millions of sites would help make the internet a more civil space. He saw a blog as the unedited voice of a person. Your blog was a space where no one could tell you to shut up. And once we gave everyone such a space, maybe people would fight less and communicate better. Now that hope, I'm sorry to say, has yet to materialize. So let's move on to the second part of the definition. In blogs, the newest material goes at the top of the page. I think this style of organization came naturally to the programmers and computer scientists who were among the web's first publishers. They were thinking in terms of stacks, last in, first out data structures that are a pretty commonplace idea in lots of software. And you find them in many types of log files and change histories and so on. This kind of reverse chronological organization is embedded in the DNA of the web from the very start. You find it on Tim Berners-Lee's first website at the start of the 1990s. There's a reverse chronological list of web servers. When new ones came online, he added them at the top. There's NCSA when it was a new website. Now, when Marc Andreessen started keeping the NCSA What's New page, which later became the Netscape What's New page, it followed exactly the same format. When media professionals arrived in a wave on the web, beginning in 1994, they brought new metaphors from print and retail. Their pages were not lists. They were magazine covers or retail stores or even reservation desks. These were image maps that you could click on, and sites were flashy. Sometimes they were fun, but they were not easy to navigate. The metaphors actually got in the way. Now, another problem these early websites had was simply distinguishing new material. Publishers started putting little yellow new icons next to links, as you can see on this page from Yahoo in 1996. The trouble was, new since when? New to whom? Fortunately, the reverse chronological list never went away. And in 1997, it began turning up on a new wave of streamlined news sites in the tech area. Sites like Slashdot and Dave Weiner's Scripting News that I showed you earlier that were created by programmers and read by people like me. At the end of that year, the term weblog was coined by Jorn Barger for his site, which he called the Robot Wisdom Weblog. Now this is also where we get to the third part of the definition, lots of links. Robot Wisdom was Barger's play on the term artificial intelligence, a subject that he was passionate about, along with many other subjects. His site was an incredibly eclectic log of links. He talked about finding treasures on the web and wanting to share them. He wrote terse descriptions of his links and he centered them on the page. Now the term weblog that he introduced carried some history, some charge. In a recent piece in The Atlantic, the blogger Andrew Sullivan traced the origins of the word log in this meaning to the pre-modern era of nautical navigation. Ships would drop a weighted log in the water attached by a rope that spooled out, and then measure their speed by the length of the rope that pulled out in a particular time span. And the rope had knots on it, which is where we get the term nautical knots. Now, the speed and course was then marked in a book that was called a log. To me, I heard weblog and I thought of Star Trek and the captain's log. That was where my head was at. But I think Barger's original starry design, which you can see here, also pointed in that direction. He had this thing where he tracked the phases of the moon. I put a series of them on there so you could see. So in 1999, a web designer named Peter Merholtz took this term weblog and made a joke about it. So here under the heading "for what it's worth" on the bottom left. He said from now on he was going to say blog. That abbreviation spread rapidly because there was already a structure of blogs that were communicating to one another that picked up this joke, shared it, spread it around. Okay, so we start the story of blogging with these people like Justin Hall, Dave Weiner, Jordan Barger. They're all outsiders with a passion for this new form and new space. Once they and the other pioneers I write about got it started, it began to take off. In Say Everything, I tried to sort of follow a spark that started with software developers and then spread to upstart journalists, political writers, concerned citizens, and then out into the business world, pop culture, and beyond. I tell the story of Evan Williams and Meg Hourahan, the founders of the company that created Blogger 10 years ago. Blogger was the software that really first brought blogging out of the tech ghetto and onto a wider stage, beginning in 1999. It was a sort of a side project, a tool that Williams and Hourahan used to communicate with each other, even though they were actually sitting across from the same office. They'd post little notes and ideas and links to other stuff on the web. Then they thought, hey, if we make this public, it might be fun and might help our business. Turned out to be right. And then they thought, maybe we should create a tool that makes it easy for anyone else to do the same thing. Turned out to be a good idea. So from that point forward, the people and stories in my book begin to spread out, just as blogging did. I write about a young reporter named Josh Marshall who started blogging during the Florida vote recount in 2000. His site, Talking Points Memo, became a sort of test bed for using a blog for investigative journalism. From there, I go on to describe how blogging found a home at big companies, most notably this one. At a time when Microsoft's public image was battered by a long antitrust battle, individual bloggers stepped forward to put a human face on the big company. Credit should go here to Joshua Allen, who started a Microsoft blog a decade ago. Did you make it here? No? Okay, Josh and I emailed before and said he was going to try to make it, but had a product to unveil, and I understand that that takes precedence. He started a decade ago. That started a movement inside the company. And the Microsoft blogs became the focus of a lot of public attention a few years later, beginning around 2003 in the era of Robert Scoble. And they remain, I think, a model of how useful blogs can be in breaking down the barriers between a big company, its customers, and its public. I go on to tell the story of Nick Denton and his Gawker sites, who really invented the notion of professional blogging, which until that point was really a contradiction in terms. They fed the obsessions of their readers in smart ways and refined an acid voice that was so effective, many readers came to assume that this voice was what blogs were all about. But they also took something that had been driven by love and passion and turned it into a more cutthroat, frantic sort of enterprise. So I compare the story of Gawker to the success of another blog you might know, Boing, which was started as a labor of love, turned into a lucrative business without ever losing its voice. Then I also tell the story of a blogger named Heather Armstrong of Deuce.com. She became somewhat well known in 2002 for losing her job as a web developer because she had indiscreetly posted catty comments about her coworkers. Later she wrote, "My advice to you is, be ye not so stupid." Afterwards, she started blogging about her family, and then once she became a mom, about her young daughter. She's a funny writer. Her blog became really popular. When she faced a severe postpartum depression, she found support among her readers that helped her recover. Now, I hope that the book can tell these stories better than I can in just a few minutes here, so I'm not going to retell them at length. Instead, what I want to do in the next few minutes before I open it up to questions is give you my version of a top 10 list about blogging. Now, it's not a top 10 list of blogs because I think, honestly, that list would be different for each one of us here. Instead, here are my top 10 myths about blogging. And you may notice as I go through this list that a lot of them contradict each other. I think that's a sign of how confused our culture really still is about blogging. Okay, here we go. Myth number 10, blogging isn't journalism. So the argument is that bloggers don't pick up the phone. They don't do shoe leather reporting. They sit around in their pajamas. They're lazy. All they do is spout opinion. Now, in fact, a blog is just a format for a website. Journalism is a practice. It's something you do anytime you go out and you try to figure out what the real story is in a situation and tell other people about it. So the whole attempt to put blogs off in this corner and journalism in that is really misguided, I think. But it is argued ad nauseum. So really, I'm going to do a service for you. I'm going to boil down the controversy into fewer syllables than a haiku. Some bloggers are doing journalism. Others aren't. It's really not that hard. Okay, myth number 9. Blogs will kill journalism or blogs will replace journalism. Now, most bloggers who aren't doing journalism don't claim to be journalists. And you almost never hear bloggers themselves say that they expect mobs of bloggers to replace professional journalism as we know it. That's really a red herring. What bloggers have done regularly and for years now is point out problems in mainstream news coverage. They do so loudly and persistently and sometimes rudely. Meanwhile, at the same time, the media industry is facing a kind of a financial meltdown. Most of the financial troubles of the media business, and particularly newspapers, have been unfolding for decades, and they stem from bad business decisions. Blogs themselves have actually done very little to undermine the news business, but there's no question that it's in trouble. So we end up constantly hearing asked the same question: will blogs be able to fill the void? Of course not. But they'll serve as an important source of information in many areas, and they'll provide a great petri dish for experiments in online news delivery that might help us figure out how to fill that void. Myth number 8, there is a blogosphere. So the word blogosphere entered the parlance around 2002, and it's appealing. It has a nice ring. It encapsulates what we intuitively understand about blogs, that they exist in a complex network that forms a sort of ecosystem of news and information. Bloggers form communities naturally, and sometimes these communities connect to one another. The blue blobs that you see here are groups of tightly cross-linked blogs. There are a lot of them. So there's a problem anytime we say the blogosphere, because there are actually lots of different blogospheres. The political bloggers think they are the blogosphere. The tech bloggers think they are the blogosphere. The business bloggers, and on and on. Really, the blogosphere is whoever you read. Myth number 7, the first blogger. Now, of course, we can identify some key early practitioners. That's part of what I tried to do in Say Everything. But there was no first blog. And trying to identify one, as many people have done, is really a pointless exercise. It's like asking who was the first novelist or playwright or poet. These are all forms that evolved, and blogging did too. Myth number 6, bloggers are narcissists. So there's this assumption that bloggers write about themselves because they think the whole world is interested in the details of their lives. But in fact, most personal bloggers are only writing for a small group of friends and relatives, coworkers. They don't think everyone else cares about their mundane affairs any more than someone having a phone conversation does. Now, of course, you can find narcissists on the web, but to blog well, you have to learn to link well. Blogging is really a social, convivial kind of pursuit. If all you do is stare at your own navel, you're not going to get very far. Myth number 5 is a twofer. Two sides of a coin. Bloggers are extra honest, or bloggers can't be trusted. Now, a lot of bloggers say that if you're blogging, you ought to keep it real. The act of blogging compels you to be authentic. Now, there's certainly a more informal tone, a kind of casualness that comes naturally to the writing on a blog, but we shouldn't mistake that tone for authenticity or trustworthiness. You can be informal, write in a human voice, and still be lying. On the other hand, a lot of observers argue that blogs simply can't be trusted because they're anonymous, or because they're amateurish, or because they don't have editors. So let me take those one at a time. Anonymity. An anonymous blog, like an anonymous anything, should be treated with caution and care. But anonymity can also help us hear from whistleblowers or people who live under repressive governments, or just hear stories from inside a workplace or an institution that we would never have heard if they had to be signed. In those cases, anonymity is actually expanding the truth that's available to us. Amateurism. Now, I wish I could say that I trust news professionals more than amateurs, because I've been one myself, but I spent too many years in a newsroom. And I can tell you that for every careful, reliable, fair, professional journalist out there, there's another with a hidden agenda or a lazy technique or burned out ethics. Amateurs and pros can both be trustworthy or unreliable. And I haven't found any correlation between those two categories. Finally, editors. A good editor is a gift. I'm happy to say I had one for this book. But sadly, there are as many editors that subtract value as that add value. And the editorial process often leaches the personal voice out of writing and sometimes even introduces new error. At least on most blogs, you know exactly who's responsible for what you're reading. In the end, I think that trust just works differently online than in traditional media. With a newspaper or magazine or broadcast outlet, reputation is a byproduct of the institution. On the web, your reputation is a product of who links to you and what they say about you. Each approach has some advantages, but I think it's pretty silly to say that one or that either of them has a monopoly. Myth number 4, there are too many blogs. Okay, you hear this one a lot. There are a huge number of blogs. The number that you hear most often is from Technorati, 133 million blogs globally as of about a year ago. Now, some huge fraction of those are actually abandoned blogs, so the real number is almost certainly much smaller than that. But however you cut it, there are millions of blogs. And that's far more than anyone could possibly read, right? What a nightmare. But wait a minute, I don't think it's a nightmare, I think it's great. I don't feel any obligation to try to keep up with all of this. I choose which blogs to read the same way I choose a small number of books to read out of the thousands that are published each year, or a tiny fraction of the movies that are released each year. Myth number 3, blogging is dead. So at the same time that some people are complaining that there are too many blogs, others are telling us that blogging is finished. It's like that old Yogi Berra line, no one goes there anymore, it's too crowded. Today, the idea that blogging is dead comes chiefly from early adopters in Silicon Valley and the technology industry. Many of them started blogs in the early part of this decade. Now they're tired. They're excited by Facebook or Twitter, other kinds of online social networks, and there's nothing wrong with that. Any individual blog has a life cycle. Starts with a certain energy or passion. When that runs out, so does the blog. Fine. But losing interest yourself doesn't mean that it's time to write an obituary for the whole phenomenon. Myth number 2, blogging is trivial. This word trivial attached itself to blogging very early on. Blogs just looked unimportant to the journalists who first wrote about them. The items were so short. The technology was so cheap. The posts were such a mishmash of personal and political. And what about all those cats? But today, in all the debates that really matter in our society, blogs are where the substantive action is. If you want to understand an issue like healthcare reform, or the real estate and banking meltdown, or indeed the debate about the future of journalism, they're all happening on the blogs that specialize in these subjects. Blogs are the new public sphere. They're where we can go as deep as we want in any particular area. They're where we wrangle out the details of our policies and the shape of our culture. I don't think there's anything trivial about that. Finally, the number 1 myth about blogging, most blogs stink. It's amazing how often you hear this. It's almost a ritual requirement. Anytime you say to someone, well, I read blogs, of course, most of them aren't any good. Now, when I hear this, I think of, I grew up as a science fiction fan. There's a principle in that world called Sturgeon's Law. after the author Theodore Sturgeon, who defended the genre when people said it was junk. He said, yeah, 90% of science fiction is crap. That's because 90% of everything is crap. So in a Sturgeon's law sense, maybe most blogs do stink. We've all seen blogs that are silly or dumb or just sloppily put together. But we should also recognize that most blogs that have any staying power are the product of someone's passion. And I'd argue that our readiness to dismiss so many bloggers is a condescending mistake. We're too quick to be peeved at the effrontery of people who dare to write in public, even when their work is rough or unpolished. Maybe we're still thinking that all of this online speech will somehow crowd out the speech that we want to hear. But the online world doesn't work that way. It's not like broadcast or print where there's a limited capacity for messages. My blog doesn't crowd out yours. There's room for everyone. So that's my 10 myths. But you know, sometimes it's really nice to go to 11. So in closing, I want to talk a little personally about one more myth, a misunderstanding that I think is still really widespread. The idea that sooner or later, one day, the immature web will grow up, put on a suit, and stop being so rambunctious. When the web first became popular 15 years ago, people thought it would enable a new era of self-expression. I did too. But the web didn't live up to that at first. It wasn't until blogging became popular in the first part of this decade that we could see what this era really looks like. We started calling it lots of things: Web 2.0, user-generated content, participatory culture, social networking. All of these terms are really variations on a theme. They describe the same thing: the fact that we now have a mass medium that invites broad participation, that offers each of us the opportunity to add a piece of ourselves to it. Blogging was the first and in some ways still the most significant form that our contributions to the web have taken. It's provided us with a wealth of information and a lot of pleasure too. Now, when I started covering the web in the 90s, the conventional wisdom was that web media was starting out as the Wild West, but sooner or later it would become civilized. The pros, the people from Hollywood and New York who dominated the old media world, would move in and take over, and all the little people could go home. This always struck me as a pretty cynical view. I looked around at the web and saw this generous, lively outpouring of human creativity, of things that people were doing out of love or a sense of fun. I didn't want it to end. But I was a critic by training and a skeptic by inclination, and I kept questioning my enthusiasm. I worried that the cynics were probably right. We'll lose this battle, I thought, because losing these sorts of battles seemed inevitable. We'd been losing them all my life. But it's a decade later now, and we haven't lost. The little people haven't gone home. The web keeps evolving. We keep finding new ways to incorporate contributions from individuals and groups. That's the web's nature. And the businesses that think that the web can and should be tamed into some sort of variation on the television broadcast model without these contributions keep failing to make that happen. So as I wrote Say Everything, I realized I was ready to leave my old defeatism behind. I called the last chapter of the book The Twilight of the Cynics, because I wanted to say that after 15 years, we now have the evidence to declare definitively that the web is not and is never going to be like television. Unless someone messes with the laws and the principles that have shaped today's internet, the web is always going to be something that we build together. Blogs were the first building blocks in that project, and I think they're still among the most useful. So thank you. My blog is at wordyard.com. The book has a website, and I'd love to take some questions. In back.
I'm curious about your thoughts on the evolution of the interactivity of blogs. I know that when I started blogging, Blogger didn't have comments. They didn't exist. You had to use little third-party widgets, and initially it was seen as this radical thing that you could have comments on your blog, and now there are people who say it's not a blog unless you have comments. So I'm curious, kind of during your research, what you found in terms of that evolution of the role that interactivity and commenting played in blogging.
Yeah. Before, I think the earliest real comment sections on blogs started around 2001. Before that, I think the notion was that the blog was a personal site and there would be a conversation, but the conversation would be happening between blogs. You would post, you'd link to someone, they'd comment by linking back to you. And there are still bloggers, some of them extremely high-profile ones. Glenn Reynolds, Instapundit, is one of the most popular conservative political bloggers, and to this day, he doesn't have comments. So I don't actually think of it as a part of the core definition of blogging, but it's clearly considered one of the most important traits, one of the most important add-ons you can have today. And there was also a sort of evolution of how bloggers thought about comments, because at the beginning, some of the earliest bloggers shared some of the sort of idealistic view of an even earlier era on the internet, that they should never delete a comment. You know, that you were interfering with someone's free speech if you deleted a comment. Of course, the rise of spam, spam comments and things like that, meant you were going to have to start deleting anyway. And at a certain point, I think it became obvious that you weren't interfering with someone's free speech by deleting their comment, because they had many, many places on the web that they could express themselves, including starting their own blog for free. And once people got more comfortable with the idea of moderating their own comments, that the blog was sort of their space and you would open it up for conversation to commenters, but you were also going to sort of establish some rules, and whatever your rules were, you were going to enforce, that made it possible really for bloggers of many different approaches and philosophies to adapt the comments to their needs. And today, if you were starting a blog today without comments, people would be looking at you thinking, what's up? And you'd have to explain it to them if you had a good reason. Yeah.
Two questions. One is, in your research, have you found out, or did you arrive at a nomenclature of the different categories of bloggers? Kind of known as active bloggers or casual bloggers, things like that. That's the first question. The second question is, how do you see Twitter and this whole concept of this whole thing called microblogging? Do you see that as an extension of blogging or as an enhancement of blogging, or do you see all blogging sites also having that as an ingredient?
So as far as nomenclature, I think it's not in my nature to be a classifier, so I haven't really done the whole sort of breakdown of different blogging types. There have been efforts over the years, there used to be the Open Directory project, used to have all sorts of, tree-like structures defining different groups of blogs. I don't know if that's up to date anymore. And so I haven't really done that. There are lots of different, if you poke around, you'll find people who are obsessively categorizing blogs out there, but wasn't really part of what I tried to do. Twitter is obviously, on everyone's mind right now. It's been a huge sensation. There's something ironic to me, because I did a lot of reading in my research for the book of the early days of Blogger, and Evan Williams, who started Blogger, is also the CEO of Twitter and one of the key people in its development. And if you look at those early Blogger blogs, they were short, one-line posts. Sometimes they were about what they were up to, and sometimes they were links. And when you look at those pages, they look remarkably like a Twitter page today. So in one way, Twitter is sort of a return to a particular style of blogging that was popular in the early adopters of Blogger. How it's affecting blogging, I think, is very positively. There was always this complaint about bloggers that we often heard from critical people in the media saying, who wants to know what you're having for lunch? Why are you telling me this on your blog? Well, now they get to ask that question about Twitter. People who are posting that kind of thing are probably going to do it today on Twitter or on a Facebook update or something like that, because it just makes more sense. The people who you want to reach with that kind of message are likely to be tuned in on a network like that. So blogs have been sort of redefined or repositioned a little bit by the rise of these new services to be more substantial. A blog is today more likely where you're going to put a longer idea that you want to develop, record an experience that you want to remember later. And so blogging has actually been made, I think, a little smarter. by Twitter.
More well-framed, I guess, right? The blogs are more well-defined or more well-framed, more thought put into blogs as compared to
more well-defined,
casually chat.
And we see this in the history of media. When a new medium arrives, it almost never kills off the medium that preceded it. Television didn't kill off radio, movies didn't kill off live theater. These forms still exist, but the new medium redefines the old and actually helps, in many cases, helps us find what its essence is, and I think that's what's happened. Yes?
Sorry, yeah, what role do you see now and in the future audio and video playing into blogging?
Audio and video are obviously, everywhere now, and they've been, thanks to developers who made it really easy to put things on blogs that have sound or video. There was a period when it seemed like there was going to be this different, we would have these different development paths of text blogging, video blogging, audio blogging, or podcasting. And now it seems much more like what we have are streams of content from people. And some people like me are more text-oriented, so we'll just write. And other people, mix it up and put a lot of video on. And I see it all kind of being this one undifferentiated mass of stuff that people are posting in reverse chronological order. The focus of Say Everything is mostly on text because that's really where it started. But I don't see it as being fundamentally different in that sense. There is this whole other phenomenon of sometimes called life casting, where people are sort of indiscriminately turning on a stream of audio or video from their lives and finding a way to put it on the web. And it's a fascinating idea. It has all sorts of, I think, huge pitfalls that we're going to discover as more people adopt this. It's less appealing to me, or it doesn't seem as ultimately valuable, because I think that any kind of blogging involves selectivity. You're picking out something specific, you're highlighting it, you're saying, this is the moment that I want to remember or that I want to tell you about. And when you abandon that, you sort of get into this area that makes me think of Borges stories, in which the map, the representation is the same size as the thing being represented, and that sort of gives me a headache, and I don't want to think about it. So, over there.
I know our company like ours, we use blogging a lot for evangelism and community and stuff like that. Did you take a look at it on how marketers are using blogging to help drive additional sales?
Yeah, marketers have obviously, been paying really close attention to blogging from early on. I write in the book a little bit about the Clue Train manifesto, which came along about 10 years ago and was this sort of blast of the trumpet in the marketing world saying we need to use more authentic voices. We can't be speaking in this impersonal way that our industry has gotten into. And I think that the bloggers who are using marketing effectively are marketers who are using blogging effectively are finding ways to do it within the context of something that is still primarily personal. They're saying, here I am, here's what I'm up to, here are the things that I'm curious about, here's what I want to tell you about, what I'm excited about. They're not sort of doing it institutionally. When you do it institutionally, too often you end up with something that is almost just like a series of press releases on a blog, and that doesn't really serve anyone's purpose. You might as well just have the old-fashioned page of press releases. How are we on time?
We've got about 8 more minutes.
Oh, great. Okay. Here.
I'm curious about demographics of bloggers, especially the age cohort. Is it shifting? Are bloggers now, as microblogging has risen, are the text bloggers, more substantive bloggers tending to get older, or are new people coming in also taking up blogging?
Yeah, the demographics, I think, haven't changed that much. It's always been something that skewed a little bit more to the people in their 30s and 40s, well-educated, more often white than not, well split between gender after the earliest days when it was pretty heavily tech-oriented, and there it was much more male-dominated. I think clearly the energy of, college-age people and early 20s at this point is much much more focused on Facebook and MySpace and social networks, but this is constantly in flux. I haven't studied this stuff as closely as some people you may know, like Dana Boyd, but my sense is that that cohort is pretty fickle. That MySpace, I think, has lost some cachet. Facebook, now that the grown-ups are there, younger people are looking at it and saying, "Is this where I want to be?" Long term, I think what you can say with certainty is that young people will be moving quickly, exploring new forms all the time. But I think, and this is just a hunch, that just as with older media, people who weren't reading, until this most recent generation, people who weren't reading newspapers as young people would pick up that habit as they got older. I think that we'll see that with blogs, because people have a need, as their lives move on, to master a subject or to go deep into something, whether it's related to their job or something that they really have an urgent need in their life to get beyond what they can get from the mass media. I think that need isn't going to go away, and so people will continue to contribute in that way. In back.
So in your research, have you looked outside of the U.S. and really looked at reasons why blogging has been adopted in certain regions of the world but not in others?
So outside the U.S., I made a pretty conscious choice. I had a year to write this book and do all the research and write it all. And I knew I wanted to tell the story from the early days, which were mostly in the U.S. as far as I know and was able to tell. And at a certain point, I sort of said to myself, I'm going to go deep into the stuff that I can and not try to cover the globe. And so I think that there are incredible stories to tell. There are whole other books to be written about this subject in other places around the world. There's a writer I know named Cyrus Farivar who has a book coming out next year. It's Farivar. I think the title of his book is The Internet of Elsewhere. I may have that wrong. Anyway, he has been researching. He's going to tell the story of how the internet has affected, he has 4 countries that are sort of test cases. And I think that'll be one great look at that subject. Yes?
Scott, I'm wondering, do you ever see blogging becoming more mainstream as it is now, or do you feel like it's somewhat saturated with the number of people that are using it? I mean, as an example, you mentioned Facebook as a form of blogging. Well, at least on my college campus, there are 90% of the population there have Facebook accounts, whereas maybe 10% or less have blogs.
Yeah.
Do you think blogging is going to, increase as a phenomenon, or is that a point where it's mature and sort of at a stable point?
It's hard to say, but I think it's probably had hit a sort of mature state and a plateau where people who are, excited by this opportunity know that it's free, know that it's there, and will continue to step forward. I don't think it's going to dip or disappear, but I don't know that it's going to grow the way it did in its early days. It's a commitment to do a blog well. I mean, look at the numbers of abandoned blogs out there. Lots of people start them, and the opportunity cost is low. The threshold is low. You don't have to pay anyone to start a blog now the way you did in the early days when you had to buy server space. So it's there for people who want to do it. And Facebook is much less of a commitment, and Facebook has the incentive of all these other people who you're directly connected to. There is something in blogging if you're not blogging as part of a specific community, and there are those communities exist. There's one at salon.com where I used to work called Open Salon, and in that world you have a little bit of a social network and a little bit of blogging kind of fused together. Or Vox is another service like that. If you're not doing it in that kind of context, it kind of is both thrilling and a little scary, because you're sort of out there on your own. You don't know necessarily who's reading you. Some people are excited by that, but a lot of people find that sort of like, what's the point? And those people are going to flock to Facebook or Twitter or something that actually tells you, you have X number of followers or friends. Yes?
So I'm a political candidate currently for countywide political office, and there's kind of an interesting perspective that my opponents have versus me. One of my opponents has just a homepage and that's it, created by a consulting firm and with very little content on it. The other opponent has a similar sort of homepage, but is also on Facebook and Twitter, and regularly updates Twitter with roughly the same update each day on the campaign trail. And I don't do Facebook or Twitter. I have a blog, and I post some very in-depth observations on what I think the state of the campaign is, or what the state of the issues of the day. And then I have a homepage as well, made by me, not a political consultant, with a lot of information that I've posted. Am I doing things right as a political candidate, or do I need to be on Facebook and Twitter and updating every day or maybe every minute on the campaign trail?
Well, I'm wondering if I should charge you a consulting fee, but I won't. I'm happy to give you my advice gratis. I think that if you're a candidate, then your job is to go where your constituents or potential constituents are. And if I were doing it, I think having a blog as the place where you can really go in depth on issues that you're focusing on, having that is critical, and that gives you a leg up on your opponents. But you also need to reach out on Twitter and on Facebook, wherever the people in your district are. You should be there. You can be economical about how you do it. I prefer Twitter to Facebook, so I have my Twitter updates also propagate to Facebook. You can do things like that, so it's to just like take the legwork out of it if you want. But I would say do it. Don't cede that territory to your opponents.
Thanks.
I have a question. So it seems to me that there's an authenticity component, almost an implied authenticity component into blogging and microblogging. And so the other day I met a woman who's a PR person in Seattle, and she said, oh yeah, I'm Twittering as Canless Restaurant, and as, she was naming all these people that she's the Twitter voice for. And that just struck me as kind of the opposite thing.
Well, it depends. Twitter at this point is still so new that people are experimenting with all sorts of uses for it. It might be that somebody follows that restaurant, if it's the kind of place that has daily specials, and they just want to know what are the daily specials each day. It's a way to subscribe and get that information. Or if the PR person for that restaurant is letting people know about bargains or something, special deals. And that's, that doesn't, it's information that's of use to someone, that those people have a convenient channel to receive it.
It's not really a voice.
It's not a voice, no. I don't know whether Twitter at this point is quite as well developed the way, when we think of blogging, you might do that on a blog, but you would look at the blog page and see, oh, this person is using blog software to publish their daily specials. You wouldn't think of it as being something that has an authentic voice of its own. But don't forget, all of these things at bottom are just software tools, and those tools can be used in tons of different ways. So I don't think that the tool itself conveys any particular expectation about authenticity. Where you get that is in the community of usage that forms around the tool. And with Twitter, that community is certainly still evolving rapidly. On the aisle there.
Just an observation to that. So a good friend of mine for a while worked for an SEO company and actually was paid to write blogs that would incorporate links to various products that they would work on. So, and they've done the same thing with Twitter and with Facebook, with these various accounts that they have going on. And the whole point of it is just SEO. They're just propagating their stuff. But it's interesting because I read a lot of her blog posts as these different people. And, it's quite interesting because it's trying very hard to evoke the voice of the individual user who's, just using this awesome luggage. And check it out, they have it on sale over here for, $99.99 in this spot. And it's an interesting, it changed the way that I started reading other blogs as well.
Was it transparent? Did you know when you landed on that blog that this person was affiliated or had been...
No, she told me where to look. And
so it was there, but it was buried?
No. I mean, she said, oh no, I wrote this. So I went to the blog, and it turns out that blog, and she pointed to a few of her coworkers that also do this. And they're paid by the word to write these long blogs that are marketing blogs, but they're not transparently marketing blogs. They're written as sort of experiential life.
There is you'll find people in the blog world and elsewhere who, are very upset by that development, who feel that, and some of whom blame Google and say that, by essentially monetizing the link, Google sort of undermined the trust we place in the links that people are putting out there. On the other hand, the fact that Google gave small publishers a way to monetize what they did also fueled a lot of the development of a lot of the best blogs out there. So it's a tough situation. My feeling is that there's something, certainly it's a gray area, if not outright unethical, to not reveal that money was involved in, that you're not just blogging something because you feel like it. The FTC is beginning to get into this. I don't know, some of you may have seen the coverage because it's pretty recent. There's this kind of whole sub-universe of female bloggers. Sometimes some of them proudly call themselves mommy bloggers. They are, it's an amazing community of people sharing their personal experiences, but also some of them beginning to make some money from what they do because marketing people and sponsors have found that if they can get these bloggers to recommend their products, it really helps sales. And so there's a question of how much of that is actually being transparent. There's a community of bloggers called Blogher, B-L-O-G-H-E-R. They have a pretty good set of standards and rules that they expect the people who are part of their network to follow. As a consumer, I tend to trust that. Also, I'll say that if you're poking around the web and you find something that is driven by SEO, if you do a lot of reading online, you can have pretty good antenna for that. You can really see, what's going on, and it's writing that isn't really aimed at anyone reading it. It's writing that is aimed at Google's algorithm or any other search algorithm that is going to find it and use it in that way.
Maybe one more question.
Okay, one more. Yes. Thank you.
This is actually related to two previous questions. Given what's happening then with some shifting ethics, what do you think is the most successful formula for a corporate blog? To provide information and not really be that personal, or to have individuals who are spokespeople for the corporation who are passionate about the product but who identify themselves? Where do you get that information?
So I think the more personal you can, within the context of each corporation, which is going to be different, and different companies have different cultures, the more personal you can make it, the better, the more effective it will be. It does mean that the person writing it has to be sensitive to the company's culture, has to, kind of walk a line. It's a balancing act between being honest and, but if you're not, if it's really just a total impersonal voice, it's not really going to be effective as a blog. The stories that I tell in the book about Robert Scoble when he was here at Microsoft are sort of the classic instance of that. I was his reader. He was out telling the world how great Longhorn, which was what Vista was previously named, how great Longhorn was going to be. And all of these things, and then Longhorn got changed. All these things that he had been telling us about were pulled out of the development cycle. And he really, to his credit, he basically said, I blew it. I really don't have any credibility on this anymore, so I'm going to shut up about it. And it was very upfront. I read that and I thought, well, at least he's being honest about it. He's just one person at a large company that had to make some tough decisions, and I gave him credit for that instead of if he had tried to, kind of do a dance around it with double speak and, things that you sometimes get from a large company, I would have stopped reading him probably. Well, thanks again. It was really fun.